The German transmission sat on Captain James Morrison's desk like a coiled rattlesnake. 3 pages of encrypted gibberish that had already stumped the best minds at Arlington Hall Station. The cryptanalysts in Virginia had thrown everything at it. Frequency analysis, known plain text attacks, pattern recognition algorithms that would make a Harvard mathematician weep. Nothing. The code wouldn't crack. Morrison stood at his office window in Camp Hood, Texas, watching 3,000 Italian prisoners shuffle across the dusty compound in the April heat. Former soldiers of Mussolini's crumbling empire, captured in the North African desert and shipped to Central Texas like cattle. They wore surplus American uniforms with PW stenciled across the backs. They worked on local ranches for 80 cents a day. They ate better food than most civilians in wartime Italy. And one of them might be the key to breaking Hitler's code. The idea seemed insane. Morrison knew what his superiors would say. You want to give classified German intelligence to enemy prisoners? You want to trust Italians, the same bastards who'd been shooting at our boys in Sicily? But Morrison had been watching these men for 3 months. He'd read the reports. He'd seen the statistics that seemed impossible until you verified them yourself. Italian POWs in American custody were gaining 15 to 20 pounds, not losing weight like prisoners in every other war in history. Gaining it. They received medical care better than anything they'd ever known in the Italian army. Dental work, treatment for chronic conditions. One prisoner from Naples had his appendix removed by an American surgeon and wrote home that he'd been treated like a rich man in a Roman hospital. The Geneva Conventions said you had to treat prisoners humanely. America didn't just follow those rules, we wrote them. But what Morrison understood, what made him different from the rigid minds in military intelligence, was that this wasn't charity. This was a weapon. Every well-fed Italian prisoner was a walking advertisement for American superiority. Every man who received real medical care instead of being worked to death became living proof that our system worked better than fascism. And every single one of them remembered exactly how their German allies had treated them in North Africa. Morrison picked up a field report from the 34th Infantry Division. An Italian sergeant captured at Kasserine Pass had told his American interrogators, "The Germans called us macaroni eaters. They said we were cowards. When supplies ran short, they ate first. When we retreated from El Alamein, German officers shot Italians who tried to surrender." The Italians didn't love Mussolini. They feared the Germans, and they were grateful to the Americans for treating them like human beings instead of expendable trash. Morrison made his decision. It was audacious. It was probably against a dozen regulations, but it was the kind of American ingenuity that won wars while enemies were still arguing about protocol. He called for Sergeant Antonio Rossetti. The camp stretched across 700 acres of scrub brush and mesquite. Barbed wire enclosed neat rows of barracks that housed prisoners in conditions that would have seemed luxurious to soldiers in Rommel's Africa Corps. Electric lights, running water, mess halls that served 3 hot meals a day. Camp Hood was just one installation in the most sophisticated prisoner of war system ever created. By spring 1944, America held over 425,000 enemy prisoners in 511 camps scattered across the United States. Germans, Italians, a handful of Japanese, all housed, all fed, all treated according to rules that our enemies thought were signs of weakness. The death rate among POWs in American custody was less than 1%. In German camps, Allied prisoners died at a rate of 27%. In Japanese camps, 40% never came home. Our enemies saw prisoners as problems to be disposed of, burdens to be minimized, subhumans whose deaths were barely worth recording. America saw something different. We saw intelligence assets. We saw psychological warfare opportunities. We saw human beings who could be convinced that our way of life was superior to the twisted ideologies they'd been fighting for. It wasn't sentiment. It was strategy. Morrison had been a high school history teacher before the war, back when Pearl Harbor was just a naval base and Hitler was someone else's problem. He'd taught his students about the American Revolution, about how the Continental Army treated British prisoners with dignity, even when Washington's men were starving. He'd explained that cruelty was the refuge of weak civilizations, that true strength came from maintaining principles even when it was difficult. Now he was putting that lesson into practice with 3,000 Italian prisoners and one unbreakable German code. The statistics told an incredible story if you knew how to read them. Italian POWs worked on Texas ranches and earned camp script they could spend in the canteen. They bought American cigarettes. They drank Coca-Cola. They wrote letters home describing conditions their families could barely believe. Some of them, and this was the part that made Morrison's superiors nervous, were already asking if they could stay in America after the war. Enemy soldiers who wanted to defect to the country they'd been fighting against. That wasn't normal. That was proof that something fundamental had shifted. The intercepted German transmission had been bouncing between Wehrmacht units in North Africa before Italy's surrender. Now it sat encrypted, useless, while Allied forces prepared to break through the Gustav Line south of Rome. If the message contained intelligence about German defensive positions, artillery placements, communication protocols, supply routes, it could save hundreds or thousands of American lives. But the Germans had changed. Their encryption protocols, field modifications that weren't in any captured codebook, the kind of practical adaptations that happened when soldiers needed to communicate quickly in combat conditions. Arlington Hall couldn't crack it, because Arlington Hall was looking at the problem like mathematicians. Morrison needed someone who understood how German and Italian forces had actually worked together in the field. Someone who'd been there. Someone who knew the shortcuts, the slang, the informal protocols that never got written down. Someone like Antonio Rossetti, sitting in Barracks 7, probably wondering why an American captain wanted to see him. Morrison reviewed Rossetti's file one more time. Born in Milan, 1918. Conscripted into the Italian army in 1939. Trained as a signals operator. Served in Libya coordinating communications between Italian and German units. Captured at El Alamein in November 1942. 18 months in American custody without a single disciplinary incident. The file included a note from the camp commander. Cooperative, intelligent, expresses desire to return to Italy and never see another uniform again. Perfect. Morrison understood something about human nature that rigid ideologues could never grasp. Loyalty wasn't about flags or anthems or racial purity. Loyalty was about who treated you with dignity, who fed you, who gave you medical care, who asked your opinion instead of just shouting orders. The Italian army had treated Rossetti like cannon fodder. The Germans had treated him like an inferior subspecies, useful only for dying in the desert. America had given him 3 meals a day, a clean bed, and the promise that he'd go home when the war ended. Which system was Rossetti going to be loyal to? The answer was obvious, if you weren't blinded by fascist ideology or racial supremacy theories. Morrison had read reports from other camps. Italian POWs who'd been given jobs on local farms sometimes invited their American guards to family dinners when relatives visited. German prisoners who worked in lumber camps in Minnesota learned English and asked about becoming citizens. Japanese prisoners in Arizona, though fewer and more difficult to crack, occasionally provided intelligence about Imperial Army tactics, simply because they were treated like human beings for the first time in their military careers. This was America's secret advantage. Not just our industrial capacity or our 2-ocean navy, or our ability to outproduce the entire Axis combined. Our advantage was that we'd built a system based on the radical idea that all men were created equal, and we actually meant it, even when those men had been shooting at us a year ago. Morrison walked to the window again. Outside, Italian prisoners were playing soccer in a dusty field, using a ball the camp commander had purchased from the recreation fund. A few American guards watched from the shade, rifles slung casually over their shoulders. Nobody looked tense. Nobody looked scared. That scene would have been impossible in a German or Japanese POW camp. The idea of guards relaxed enough to let prisoners play sports, of captives healthy enough to run around in the Texas heat, of an entire system built on the assumption that prisoners were human beings who deserved basic dignity. It was as foreign to Axis thinking as democracy itself. America was fighting World War II on multiple fronts, but the most important battlefield wasn't in Europe or the Pacific. It was in the hearts and minds of every captured enemy soldier who realized our system was better than theirs. Morrison made the call. Within an hour, Sergeant Antonio Rossetti would walk into his office expecting interrogation and threats. Instead, he'd get a Coca-Cola, a cigarette, and a question that would change the course of the Italian campaign. Morrison smiled. The Germans thought they'd created an unbreakable code. They'd never considered that their inferior Italian allies might be the key to breaking it. That arrogance, that absolute certainty in their own superiority, was going to cost them the war. Because America understood something the Axis never could. The most powerful weapon wasn't a bomb, or a tank, or an unbreakable code. It was treating people with decency and watching them voluntarily choose to help you win. Sergeant Antonio Rossetti shuffled down the dirt path between the barracks, his heart hammering against his ribs. When the guards had come for him that morning, he'd assumed the worst. In the Italian army, being summoned meant punishment. In the German units he'd served alongside in North Africa, it meant something worse. But this was America, and nothing here made sense by the old rules. He'd been a prisoner for nearly 2 years now, captured at El Alamein in October 1942. Those first months as a POW had been a revelation that broke his brain. Instead of starvation rations, he got 3 meals a day. Instead of beatings, he got medical care for the dysentery that had plagued him since Libya. Instead of forced labor until collapse, he got paid 80 cents a day to work on local ranches. He'd gained 23 pounds. His teeth had stopped hurting. He'd learned to say, "Thank you," and "Please pass the salt," in English. Now Captain Morrison wanted to see him, and Rossetti didn't know whether to be terrified or hopeful. The MP led him into a small office in the headquarters building. Captain Morrison stood beside a desk, 30 years old maybe, with the kind of face that belonged on a teacher, not an intelligence officer. He gestured to a chair. "Sit down, Sergeant Rossetti." Rossetti sat, back straight, hands on his knees. Morrison reached into a small icebox and pulled out a glass bottle beaded with condensation. He popped the cap and set it on the desk in front of Rossetti. A Coca-Cola, ice cold. "Go ahead," Morrison said. "It's for you." Rossetti's hand trembled as he picked up the bottle. He'd had Coca-Cola exactly 3 times in his life, all of them in this camp. In Italy, it was something you saw in magazines from America, something movie stars drank. Morrison lit 2 cigarettes and offered one. Rossetti took it, waiting for the trap to spring. Instead, Morrison sat on the edge of the desk and smiled. "How's the work detail treating you? I heard you've been helping at the Jensen Ranch." "Very good, Captain. The Jensens are kind people. They said you're the best mechanic they've ever seen. Fixed their tractor in 20 minutes when it would have taken their regular guy 2 days." Rossetti nodded, still wary. In his experience, compliments always preceded demands. Morrison's smile faded slightly. His voice became serious, but not harsh. "Antonio, may I call you Antonio?" "Yes, Captain." "Antonio, I need to ask you something. Not order you. Ask. And you can say no without any consequences. Do you understand?" This was new. Rossetti nodded slowly. "We intercepted a German transmission a few weeks ago. Our code breakers can't crack it. They're brilliant mathematicians, best in the world, but they're missing something." Morrison paused. "They're missing the kind of knowledge you have." Rossetti's stomach tightened. He'd been a signals operator in the Italian army, coordinating communications between Italian and German units. He knew their procedures, their shortcuts, their habits. "I'm asking for your help," Morrison continued, "not as a prisoner helping his captor, as one professional helping another professional solve a technical problem." The cigarette trembled between Rossetti's fingers. In the German army, soldiers were machines that followed orders. In the Italian army, they were bodies to be thrown at enemies until something stuck. But this American captain was treating him like a colleague. "What is in the message?" Rossetti asked carefully. Morrison didn't lie or deflect. "We think it contains information about German defensive positions in Italy. If we can decode it, we might be able to save lives when our forces push toward Rome. Italian lives, American lives, the lives of civilians trapped in a war zone." Rossetti thought of his mother in Milan, of his sister in Florence. The war had rolled over them like a tank, and it wasn't done yet. "The Germans," Rossetti said quietly, "they treated us like dogs, worse than dogs. They laughed when we had no food. They took our equipment and gave us their broken rifles. They called us cowards and weaklings." His voice hardened. "I have no loyalty to the Germans, Captain. None." Morrison nodded. "I'm not asking you to betray Italy, Antonio. Italy switched sides last September. Your country is fighting with us now, against Germany. I'm asking you to help us beat the Germans faster, so your family stops living in a war zone." The logic was perfect and infuriating. Rossetti took a long drink of the Coca-Cola, the sweetness almost painful after years of army coffee and cigarettes. "If I help you," he said, slowly, "what happens to me? Same thing that would happen if you don't help. You stay here, you work, you wait for the war to end, you go home." Morrison leaned forward. "But I'll make sure your cooperation is noted in your file. When repatriation starts, the men who helped get priority consideration. Not a bribe, not a threat, just honest quid pro quo." "Who else are you asking?" Rossetti asked. "4 other men with signals experience: Giovanni Marchetti, Paolo Benedetti, Carlo Ferrara, and Luca Romano. All former Italian army, all captured in North Africa, all with German language skills." Rossetti knew 3 of them. Good men, smart men, men who'd survived the desert because they could think, not just follow orders. "When do we start?" Rossetti asked. Morrison's smile returned, genuine and warm. "Right now, if you're willing." The secure room was small and stuffy, thick curtains blocking the Texas sun. The 5 Italian POWs sat around a table covered with papers, intercepts, frequency logs, encryption tables. In the center sat the target. 1 German transmission, 63 groups of 4-letter blocks, transmitted 3 weeks ago. Captain Morrison stood at the head of the table. Beside him was Lieutenant Sarah Chen, a cryptanalyst from Arlington Hall who'd been working on this message for 17 days straight. "Gentlemen," Morrison began, "thank you for coming. I know this isn't something you had to do." Giovanni Marchetti, youngest of the group at 23, raised his hand like a schoolboy. "Captain, before we begin, why can't your machines crack this? I thought American computers could break anything." Lieutenant Chen answered, her voice hoarse from too much coffee and too little sleep. "Our machines can break mathematical encryptions. They can find patterns in number sequences, test millions of key combinations, identify statistical anomalies. But this," she gestured at the transmission, "this isn't just mathematics. There's something human in it, something our machines can't see." Paolo Benedetti, who'd been a sergeant in the Italian Signals Corps, leaned forward and studied the intercept. His eyes moved across the letter groups, his lips moving silently. "May I?" he asked, reaching for a pencil. Morrison slid one across the table. Benedetti circled 3-letter groups: VKST, MZPL, RTNG. These don't follow standard Wehrmacht encryption protocol. The letter frequency is wrong. It's like they're using words from a different language entirely. "That's exactly what stumped us," Chen said. "We thought maybe it was a double encryption, or a one-time pad, but the patterns are too regular for that." Carlo Ferrara, who'd coordinated Italian-German communications at Tobruk, suddenly laughed. A short, bitter bark. "Oh, those arrogant bastards." Everyone turned to look at him. "When we worked with the Germans, Ferrara explained. They hated using Italian terminology. Hated it. But sometimes they had to, because we were coordinating operations, and their Italian was worse than our German. He pointed at the intercept. What if they're using Italian military slang mixed into German encryption? Hybrid terminology that wouldn't appear in any codebook because it was never officially approved. The room went silent. Morrison's voice was barely a whisper. Show me. For the next 6 hours, the 5 Italians worked through the transmission like archaeologists excavating a hidden city. They identified Italian artillery terms buried in German sentence structure. They found field abbreviations that German and Italian units had developed together during desert operations. They discovered a hybrid communication system that existed nowhere in any manual because it had evolved organically between soldiers who had to work together despite mutual contempt. Here, Rossetti said, pointing to a sequence. This looks like German, but it's actually Italian slang for ammunition depot, spelled using German phonetics. The Germans did this because they couldn't remember the proper German military term, so they just used our word and encrypted it. Lieutenant Chen's hands flew across her notepad. If that's true for this sequence, then this pattern here might be artillery coordinates, Marchetti finished, but using the Italian grid system, not the German one. The Germans must have been working with Italian maps and just kept using the Italian coordinates. The pieces fell into place like tumblers in a lock. By midnight, they had the pattern. By 0400 hours, they had 40% of the message decoded. By 0800 hours, they had it all. Morrison read the decoded transmission aloud, his voice tight with controlled excitement. Gustav Line defensive positions, Monte Cassino sector. Artillery battery 412, located grid reference. He looked up at Lieutenant Chen. These are exact coordinates. Ammunition supply routes. Communication protocols between defensive positions. Weaknesses they're worried about on the southern approach. Chen was already on the phone to Arlington Hall. We need this forwarded to 5th Army immediately. This is operational intelligence. Priority 1. Rossetti slumped back in his chair, exhausted. Giovanni Marchetti's head was on the table. Paolo Benedetti was chain-smoking, his 4th cigarette in an hour. Captain Morrison walked around the table and shook each man's hand. 6 months of signals intelligence didn't give us what you 5 men provided in 18 hours. You just saved American and Allied lives. Probably Italian lives too, when this helps us push the Germans back faster. Luca Romano, who hadn't spoken much during the entire session, finally raised his head. His eyes were red-rimmed and tired. Captain Morrison, in the Italian army, officers gave orders. In the German army, orders were iron and words meant nothing. Here, you asked us like men. You treated us like professionals, not prisoners. That is why we helped. Morrison's face softened. Thank you, Luca. That's all I asked. They filed out of the secure room into the hot Texas morning, the intercepted pages tucked into official folders that would be moving faster than any of them. For the first time since El Alamein, Rossetti felt a small, steady thing in his chest that wasn't fear or hunger or cold. Hope. Outside, the sun climbed higher, and he let himself imagine Milan again. His mother's hands, the narrow streets, the taste of pasta in a kitchen that might still exist when the war was over. The locked room smelled like stale coffee and cigarette smoke. 5 Italian prisoners sat around a wooden table in Camp Hood's intelligence section, staring at sheets of paper covered in encrypted German text. Sergeant Antonio Rossetti traced his finger along the first line, his brow furrowed. Outside, the Texas sun baked the scrub brush, but in here the future of American soldiers fighting in Italy hung on what these former enemies could decipher. Captain Morrison leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching. He'd staked his career on a radical idea, that cultural understanding could crack codes that mathematics couldn't. Arlington Hall Station in Virginia employed some of the brightest minds in America, mathematicians, linguists, cryptanalysts who'd broken Japanese purple codes and German Enigma variants, but they'd been stumped by this particular transmission for 3 weeks. The problem wasn't the encryption itself. The Germans were using standard Wehrmacht field protocols, but something about the content made no sense. Words appeared where they shouldn't. Phrases violated German military grammar. The mathematical patterns were correct, but the decoded text was gibberish. Morrison had a theory, and it required the one thing Arlington Hall didn't have: men who'd actually served alongside German units in North Africa. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, the camp's cryptanalyst, sat at the end of the table with her decryption worksheets. She was 26 years old, a Berkeley mathematics graduate who could calculate logarithms in her head. She'd spent 2 years at Arlington Hall before transferring to Camp Hood. She'd broken Italian naval codes and Japanese merchant shipping ciphers. This German transmission had her completely stumped. "Explain what you're seeing," Morrison said to Rossetti. The Milan-born sergeant tapped a section of decoded text. "This word here, Nebel. In German it means fog, but in North Africa there was rarely fog. The Germans, they used Nebel for something else when talking to us." Giovanni Marchetti, the youngest of the group at 23, leaned forward. "Smoke. They meant smoke. The Nebelwerfer rocket launchers. They created smoke screens. We called them fog makers because the Italian word for the rockets was too long for radio." Morrison felt his pulse quicken. So when the Germans were coordinating with Italian units, they adapted their terminology? "Not just that, Paolo," Benedetti added. He'd been a signals operator at Tobruk before capture. "The Germans, they thought Italian words were more secure sometimes. If the British intercepted, they expected German. But German officers throwing in Italian terms? It confused the listening posts." Chen's eyes widened. "It's a hybrid cipher. They're using Italian military slang as code words within the German encryption." Carlo Ferrara, who'd coordinated ammunition supply convoys, nodded vigorously. "In Africa Corps, we had maybe 50 words like this. Not official, not in any manual. Just what we used in the field because it was faster." This was the breakthrough. The German message wasn't pure German. It was the linguistic residue of combined Axis operations, where German officers had borrowed Italian military terminology for field convenience. No American codebreaker, no matter how brilliant, could crack this without someone who'd actually lived through those North African campaigns. Morrison grabbed a notepad. "I need every Italian term you remember the Germans using. Every slang word, every abbreviation, every field modification of standard German." The room erupted into rapid Italian as the 5 prisoners argued and remembered. Rossetti wrote furiously, filling page after page. Carosello meant artillery preparation, borrowed from the Italian word for carousel, because the shells went round and round. Spazzatura meant decoy positions, literally trash or garbage. Phantasma meant fake tank formations made of canvas and wood. Chen was already applying the new vocabulary to the encrypted transmission. Where the standard German decryption had produced fog position 12, she now read smokescreen position 12. Where it had said trash convoy route, she now understood decoy supply route. Luca Romano, the oldest at 37, suddenly slapped the table. "Wait! This phrase here, secondo piano, that's not German at all. That's pure Italian. Second floor, second story." "What did it mean in the field?" Morrison asked. "Secondary defensive position. The Germans picked it up from us because their word, Zweitstellung, was too long for quick radio. They'd say, secondo piano, and we knew they meant the fallback line." The pieces were falling into place. Chen worked through the transmission line by line, the Italian prisoners calling out translations, Morrison verifying against the German military vocabulary they'd compiled from previous intercepts. What emerged was staggering. The decoded message revealed German defensive preparations along a 15-kilometer stretch of the Gustav Line. Artillery battery positions protecting Monte Cassino. ammunition dump locations near Highway 6, communication trenches connecting strong points, supply routes bringing shells and food to forward positions, and crucially, weaknesses. The German officer who'd sent this message was reporting problems to his superior. The secondo piano defensive position near San Pietro had flooded during spring rains. Artillery shells were running low at position Spazzatura 4. The smoke generator crews were down to half strength from Allied bombing raids. 6 hours into the session, Chen looked up from her worksheets. "I've got 90% of it decoded. This is intelligence gold." Morrison read the translated text. His hands trembled slightly. This wasn't just useful information. This was a detailed blueprint of German defensive thinking in central Italy. Fifth Army could use this to plan their assault. Artillery could target the ammunition dumps. Infantry could avoid the strongest positions and probe the weak points. Marchetti spoke quietly. "My family lives 20 kilometers from Monte Cassino. If this helps the Americans break through faster, maybe they live through this war." The room went silent. These weren't abstract military targets on a map. These were real places where real people, including the families of the men in this room, were trapped in the fighting. Morrison understood something in that moment that the German high command never could. These Italian prisoners weren't helping America because they'd been threatened or coerced. They were helping because American success meant Italian liberation. They were helping because Morrison had treated them like professionals instead of criminals. They were helping because Captain Morrison had bought them Coca-Cola and asked their opinion. By midnight, the complete translation was finished. Chen typed the final report on her typewriter, 3 carbon copies, classification stamp in red ink. Top secret. Morrison would send it through secure channels to Fifth Army headquarters in Italy within hours. Rossetti lit a cigarette, looking exhausted but satisfied. "Captain, I have a question." "Go ahead. Why did you ask us? Why not just keep trying with your machines and your mathematicians?" Morrison considered his answer carefully. "Because our machines are brilliant at mathematics. But war isn't just mathematics. It's people. It's culture. It's the slang soldiers use when they're tired and scared and just want to go home. You can't program that into a machine." Benedetti smiled. "The Germans, they think war is about superior engineering and superior discipline. They would never ask prisoners for help. They would see it as weakness. That's why they're losing," Chen said flatly. She gathered her worksheets. "This decryption was impossible without you. Arlington Hall could have worked on this for 6 months and gotten nowhere. You did it in 6 hours." The final piece of the operation came from Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, Morrison's superior officer, who arrived at 0200 hours to review the decoded transmission. He read it twice, then looked at Morrison with something approaching awe. "This is the most detailed intelligence on Gustav line defenses we've received from any source. We've got reconnaissance flights. We've got resistance reports. We've got signal intercepts. But this," he held up the translated document, "this tells us what the Germans are worried about. That's worth more than 100 aerial photographs." Hayes turned to the 5 Italian prisoners. "Gentlemen, on behalf of the United States Army, thank you. Your assistance will save American lives. I'm making a recommendation that you all receive priority consideration for repatriation when Italy is liberated." Rossetti translated for the others. Romano, the oldest, actually had tears in his eyes. After Hayes left with the intelligence report, Morrison dismissed the team. As they filed out, Marchetti turned back. "Captain Morrison, when I was in the Italian army, officers treated us like donkeys. The Germans treated us like donkeys who didn't even speak proper German. You treated us like we had something valuable to offer. I will remember this." Morrison watched them walk back toward the barbed wire compound in the dark Texas night. Tomorrow, this intelligence would be in the hands of American commanders preparing to assault the Gustav Line. Artillery officers would adjust their targeting. Infantry companies would probe the weak points his team had identified. Soldiers who would have walked into German ambushes would live, because 5 Italian prisoners had spent 18 hours translating hybrid German-Italian field slang. The genius wasn't the decryption itself. The genius was recognizing that the solution required human experience, not just technical skill. The genius was building a POW system where captured enemies felt comfortable volunteering to help. The genius was Morrison's fundamental understanding that treating people with dignity turned them into allies. Chen returned to the room with fresh coffee. "Do you realize what we just proved?" "What's that?" "That kindness is an intelligence weapon. That every Italian prisoner who goes home and tells his family about American fairness is psychological warfare. That our POW system isn't just humane, it's strategically superior to anything the Axis could comprehend." Morrison sipped the coffee. It was terrible, but it was 0300 hours and he'd been awake for 20 hours. The Germans think strength means brutality. They can't imagine that strength might mean restraint. They can't conceive that offering a prisoner Coca-Cola and respect could be more effective than torture. "And that's why we're going to win," Chen said. Outside, the Texas night was cool and clear. Somewhere in Italy, American soldiers were dug into positions facing the Gustav Line. Soon they'd receive intelligence that would change their tactical planning. Some of them would live through battles they otherwise wouldn't have survived. All because Captain Morrison understood that America's greatest weapon wasn't our industrial capacity or our military technology. It was our ability to see the human being inside the enemy uniform. To recognize that most soldiers weren't fighting for ideology. They were fighting because they'd been conscripted, trained, and sent to war. And when treated with respect, when given the choice to do something meaningful, many would choose to help. And that choice could change the course of a battle, and sometimes a war. The radio crackled to life at exactly 05:47 hours on May 18, 1944. Second Lieutenant Frank O'Brien, crouched in a muddy ravine 3 miles south of Cassino, Italy, heard words that would save his entire platoon. "Alpha 37, abort advance. Confirmed MG-42 emplacement. Coordinates provided. Repeat, abort advance." O'Brien froze his 32 men just 200 yards from a perfectly camouflaged German machine gun position that would have cut them to ribbons. The intelligence was so precise, it included the exact angle of the gun's traverse arc and the blind spot in its field of fire. What O'Brien never knew, what he wouldn't learn until decades later at a reunion in Milwaukee, was that this life-saving intelligence hadn't come from aerial reconnaissance or partisan scouts. It came from 5 Italian POWs sitting in a secure room at Camp Hood, Texas, drinking Coca-Cola and decoding German transmissions. The decoded message that Sergeant Antonio Rossetti and his team cracked contained far more than just defensive positions. When Fifth Army intelligence officers received the full decryption on May 12th, they discovered an intelligence windfall that would reshape the entire Italian campaign. The transmission revealed German concerns about Monte Cassino's supply situation. Specifically, it detailed ammunition shortages, morale problems among conscripted troops, and, most critically, a flooded section of the Gustav Line defenses that the Germans themselves considered vulnerable. Major Robert Hayes, Morrison's superior at Camp Hood, forwarded the intelligence with a simple notation. Source reliability, exceptional. Information confirmed by subsequent prisoner interrogations. Within 72 hours, Fifth Army planners had incorporated the decoded intelligence into their operational plans. The flooded defensive section Rossetti's team identified became a focal point for Allied probing attacks. The ammunition shortage information helped time the final push, and O'Brien's platoon, advancing toward Cassino in mid-May, received tactical warnings based on artillery coordinates that 5 former enemies had voluntarily decoded 6,000 miles away. The Germans never saw it coming. Their supposedly unbreakable field cipher, their clever hybrid of German encryption and Italian slang, their operational security protocols, all of it undone by the men they'd treated as inferior allies. Back at Camp Hood, Captain Morrison sat in his office, reviewing after-action reports from Italy. The decoded transmission had contributed to planning for Operation Diadem, the final Allied offensive that would break the Gustav Line and open the road to Rome. Morrison's report to Hayes was characteristically understated. POW cooperation team performed beyond expectations. Intelligence value confirmed by theater commanders. Recommend expansion of program. But privately, Morrison understood what they'd accomplished. They'd proven that America's approach to prisoners of war wasn't just morally superior, it was strategically brilliant. The contrast couldn't have been starker. In German POW camps, Allied prisoners were dying at a rate of 27 per 100. In Japanese camps, the death rate exceeded 40 per 100. These weren't accidents or unfortunate circumstances. They were the predictable results of systems built on cruelty and racial ideology. American camps? The death rate among Axis POWs was less than 1 per 100, lower than the mortality rate of American civilians. Those numbers represented more than humanitarian achievement. They represented intelligence opportunities that America's enemies literally couldn't imagine. By summer 1944, the Camp Hood operation had expanded. Over 200 German and Italian POWs across the United States were actively assisting in translation, decryption, and intelligence analysis work. They weren't coerced. They weren't threatened. They volunteered because the American system showed them something they'd never experienced under fascism: respect for individual human worth. Sergeant Rossetti received his priority repatriation papers in September 1944, shortly after Rome fell to Allied forces. But he didn't use them immediately. Instead, he requested permission to remain at Camp Hood as a civilian contractor, continuing his signals intelligence work. "My family is safe now," he told Morrison. "The Americans helped make that happen. I want to finish the job." Giovanni Marchetti, the youngest member of the decryption team, wrote letters home to Milan that would later be preserved in Italian archives. One passage captured the profound psychological shift these men experienced. "Mama, the Americans treat us like we are people, not numbers. They ask our opinions. They pay us for work. They give us the same food they eat. I have gained 18 pounds since capture. When this war ends, I think I want to come back here. This is what the future should be." That letter, multiplied by thousands, became psychological warfare more powerful than any propaganda broadcast. POWs returned to Italy and Germany with stories of American abundance, fairness, and opportunity. They became walking advertisements for the superiority of democratic capitalism over fascist tyranny. The Japanese and Germans could never replicate this advantage because their entire ideologies were built on racial supremacy and contempt for the defeated. They saw prisoners as subhuman. America saw them as potential allies, intelligence sources, and proof that our system worked. By war's end, over 425,000 Axis POWs had been held in American camps. The vast majority returned home with positive views of the United States. Over 5,000 Italians and 20,000 Germans eventually immigrated to America, many of them illegally because they couldn't wait for official channels. Think about that. Men we captured on battlefields, men who'd fought against American soldiers, wanted desperately to become Americans. They'd seen our country from behind barbed wire and decided it was superior to their homelands. In 1947, Antonio Rossetti immigrated to the United States legally. He became a naturalized citizen in 1952, and in 1954 he was hired by the newly formed National Security Agency, where he worked in signals intelligence until his retirement in 1979. When interviewed in 1985 about his decision to help decode German transmissions, Rossetti's answer was simple and profound. "Captain Morrison showed me that there were people who fought for something better than just power. I wanted to be on that side. I wanted my children to grow up in that world." The final accounting of the Camp Hood operation came in lives saved rather than battles won. The intelligence from that single decoded transmission contributed to tactical decisions that prevented ambushes, identified weak points in German defenses, and helped Fifth Army planners optimize their breakthrough operations. Lieutenant O'Brien's platoon was one of dozens that benefited from intelligence rooted in that Texas decryption room. How many American soldiers came home to their families because 5 Italian POWs voluntarily cracked a code? The exact number is unknowable, but the principle is clear. America won World War II through industrial supremacy, yes, through military innovation, absolutely, but also through something our enemies fundamentally couldn't comprehend: the strategic power of decency. The Axis powers built their entire war machines on brutality, racial ideology, and contempt for human dignity. They thought this made them strong. Instead, it made them predictable, rigid, and ultimately defeatable. America built a POW system on Geneva Convention standards, practical self-interest, and the revolutionary idea that even enemies deserved humane treatment. Our enemies thought this made us weak. Instead, it gave us intelligence advantages they never saw coming, and psychological warfare victories they couldn't counter. In the scrub brush of Central Texas, in a locked room where former enemies drank Coca-Cola and worked beside American cryptanalysts, the fundamental truth of World War II played out in miniature. Freedom beats fascism. Respect beats brutality. And America's unique genius for turning enemies into allies would prove more powerful than all the tanks and bombs ever built. That's not propaganda. That's just what happened when 5 Italian prisoners of war helped crack a German code and changed the course of a campaign. They did it voluntarily. They did it effectively. And they did it because America showed them there was a better way to be.